Mm.
Oh, I see that I can click on Q&A to see the questions that people type in there.
Great, that'll be a big help.
So it's saying as a panelist, the host would like to promote you to be a panelist. You can unmute and start video, which means you'll be visible. So does that mean it might actually work for me to be visible? Ah, okay. Let me get to my other seat then and see if that, oops, I didn't click it and now it's gone. Now it's not giving me that option. Oh, there. Joined as a panelist. Okay.
Yeah, we are able to see you, Dana. You are a panelist.
You'll be able to see me, but I won't be able to talk through the laptop. I still have to be on the phone. Is that correct?
No, you can speak through your laptop.
I can.
Yeah.
I can through my laptop. Okay. Well, let me just move seats, and I'll try that, and I'll just put my phone down and not hang up until I see that it's working. Just a moment. I see my phone there as a call-in, but let me see if I can talk through my headset. Just a moment.
Yeah, a warm welcome to all attendees. Thank you for joining us. We will begin in a minute or so to allow additional participants to join. Thank you again. Yeah, thank you for joining. A warm welcome to everyone, to all the panelists and the attendees for today's session. A very good evening, good afternoon, morning from different parts of the world that are joining. So today's session, this 90-minute session will be focusing on how distributed energy resources can support the energy transition. And we have a really exciting lineup of speakers and as well case studies from various countries and different continents. Go to the next slide, please. Before we get started, a few housekeeping rules. We request all participants and of course speakers to keep your mobiles silent and also to keep your mics on mute when not speaking. The session will be in English language and we do have interpretation options for Bahasa and Chinese. We will have a we'll have opportunity for question and answers towards the end of the session, and we encourage you to type these in the Q&A box and direct these to a specific speaker. We also will try to give an opportunity for you to raise your hand to ask your questions. We request speakers to keep your videos on when you're speaking, especially. For participants who are joining through the WOA platform, just click to add this particular session A2 to your, to the agenda as shown here, and you can then view the session to attend it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so coming to today's agenda, in this 90-minute session, we would have Mark kickstarted. He would be moderating the session. Mark is from the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. So Mark would then deliver a presentation to set the stage. We would then have a presentation on the roadmap for DERs by Santiago. And we would then have case studies, 4 case studies, one by Diana Kenny, one by Mark Matsura, also from Abhishek Ranjan and Dr. Adarsh Nagarajan. After these presentations, we would then open the floor for discussions and any questions and any inputs or experiences that participants themselves have on this topic. Finally, we would close with some closing remarks and an introduction to the community of practice that we are coordinating. Next slide, please. Yeah, so before we begin, a brief introduction to Mark Glick. He's a specialist on energy policy and innovation, working with the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. Mark has considerable experience across a 4-decade career, and he's been leading the energy policy practice focused on transitions and associated economic growth in Hawaii. And he's also been working considerably in the Asia Pacific region. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. It's just very exciting to be here and to be participating in this important effort. And as you already mentioned, we have 5 outstanding panelists, speakers that are true experts in distributed energy resource systems and have been working very significantly in the area. Let's see, does my slide deck come up? There we go. Excellent. First I'd like to say that on a global scale, nations and international alliances have stimulated innovation to tackle the greatest challenge of our time, and we all know that to be climate change. As a result, a key focus of the global landscape is now on the renewable energy and energy transition movements. Bloomberg New Energy Finance reports that the pace of energy transition investments in 2020 was a record $501.3 billion US towards decarbonization. And it's really quite amazing, that figure. It was higher than 2019, even though that was a COVID-19 depressed area. And it's worth noting that innovation has gone well beyond technological change alone and has extended into national, or what I call regime and local niche policies and initiatives that place communities and cities and regions at the center of action. Nothing exemplifies this place-based center of action better than distributed energy resources, DERs. And for many, DERs are seen as the mechanism for societal empowerment through accelerating sustainable energy transformation, particularly through corporate sourcing of renewable energy and through community applications of renewables, whether in cities or in island and rural off-grid areas. In this slide that you're looking at, basically, the role of DERs is increasing as a resource for residential and commercial buildings for the purpose of lighting and powering communities in cities and rural areas. Now, we'll hear about the many benefits attributed to DERs, including the society-wide engagement and empowerment of all stakeholders as an effective way to accelerate a localized energy transition. But I'd suggest that it holds particular promise for the 940 million people globally who are still without electricity. 520 million of that total are in South Asia alone. Energy access and increasing energy demand are forcing innovations like DERs, where in the Asian region, for example, energy demand has grown 2.5 times since 1990 and may well triple by 2035. You know, it's one thing to have energy transitions in a flat demand environment, but when you're growing, when you have growing energy demand, it's a much more challenging enterprise. So if we want to meaningfully accelerate progress to the SDG 7 goal of universal electricity, and if we want to do that through DERs, multiple actions and innovations are required. These include new policies and regulations, updated delivery and financial models, reimagined institutional frameworks, enhanced capacity building, and increased technology adaptation and expanded cross-sector linkages. Next slide. So, as you'll hear, DERs include wind, solar battery storage, and other small-scale power devices connected at the grid edge. Our speakers will provide even more detailed descriptions and definitions on the full range of DERs that are emerging as a critical part of the energy transitions taking place around the world. The deployment of DERs can support resilience through increasing overall and spatial diversity of generation resources, for example. You know, take for example, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack that may remove a large or centralized power plant generating facility from service, but a dispersed DER system will not necessarily be impacted. We learned that through USAID NREL Resilient Energy Platform study that came in 2020. Also, the value of DERs, for example, like demand response and distributed generation, comes from the ability to defer or displace expansion of the upstream grid and generation, or its capacity value. We find that these benefits often cannot be easily set by markets. And we learned that from Peter Fox-Penner in his book, Smart Power, which is as relevant today as it was when he wrote that book in 2014. Countries and regions are increasingly making ambitious and far-reaching commitments to climate action, with almost 30 already set to achieve net zero in the coming decades. That's setting a new political momentum and fertile ground for an ambitious energy transition pace. Now, we know that from IRENA and a World Energy Transition Outlook, which is really hot off the press from this year. Fundamentally, we increasingly see DERs as a key part of the NDC toolkit. And it's within that context that our discussion of DERs today is focused. For these reasons and more, DERs offer significant revenue growth prospects for all key market participants, including technology, original equipment manufacturers, system integrators and installers, energy service companies, and utility companies. You know, it wasn't really just a few years ago, no one could envision that everyone at the table might benefit, but there's something in it for everyone, potentially. And finally, I want to say that you'll hear from HNEI's Mark Matsuura about the changing criteria for DER adoption and interconnection in Hawaii. And that occurred when our federal and state tax credits, our net metering program, and our high electricity rates collided, actually, to overheat and really overheat the rooftop solar market. Rooftop solar adoption grew at such a rate that, can you believe that in 2012, 28.5% of all new new construction in the state of Hawaii could be attributed to rooftop solar installations. Now, in attempting to provide a more orderly and balanced DER growth, planners in Hawaii had prepared a conceptual model for the evolution of distribution systems, followed by a summary of the key planning and operations and market functions that are required to support increasing levels of DERs. The conceptual model and functional requirements offer a systematic framework for these future distribution system improvements. The table that you see here is a three-stage diagram of the distribution system evolution, and that was developed by Paul DiMartini in 2015. That truly was an after-the-fact illustration of some of the steps that we provided in Hawaii to kind of deal with this rapidly changing DER market. Mark Matsuura's presentation will bring you up to speed where the market has fully evolved. This variant was borrowed from a model that's been used to inform distribution planning in several jurisdictions in the United States and utilized by the U.S. Department of Energy's DSPX initiative to define a next generation distribution system platform. And that was somewhat intended to help guide and assist the development and evaluation of distribution grid modernization. Now, to move DERs forward, nothing is more important than a realistic distributed energy resources roadmap. Fortunately, such a guidance document now exists, and our initial speaker, Santiago Enriquez of ABT Associates, will provide an overview based on an October 2020 report stemming from the USAID sponsored work that he and his colleagues have done. He was an author of that report, and as a USAID senior environmental and climate change specialist, no one's more qualified to talk about that report. So with that overview, I now turn the session over to our first speaker, Santiago Enriquez Soltero.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be joining you today from Mexico. Next slide, please. So my presentation today, as Mark mentioned, is based on a report that we developed under the USAID-funded CEDAR activity. So let me start by sharing with you some key facts about CEDAR. The activity's full name was Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience. And it was a global $20 million activity that was funded by USAID. At CEDAR, we had two main objectives. The first was to work with different partners from the private sector, civil society, and governments to build a very strong economic and financial case for interventions in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the second was to mobilize and provide access to finance from public and private funds to support such interventions, focusing both in climate, in clean energy and sustainable landscapes from the mitigation side, and also in adaptation actions. CEDAR closed its activities earlier this year, but we were able to work in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So the image on the right side of the screen shows the cover of the report on which my presentation is based. I will not be able to cover everything that we discuss in a report because of time constraints, but I invite you to download the report using the link that is shown on the bottom of it, and then to be able to take a deeper look at it. And when we developed this report, really what we're trying to do was come up with some recommendations and guidance that would help governments and utilities to prepare roadmaps or plans for distributed energy resources. And we looked at a very broad range of technologies. In particularly, we looked at DRs that are somehow connected to the microgrids, or even microgrids that are connected to the main grid. But we just didn't look into a lot of detail into off-grid systems or smaller systems that would not be connected to that grid. And then our methods consisted principally of conducting desktop research, good practices of these roadmaps and plans in the United States. Then having interviews with some of the utilities, government regulators, and regional grid market operators that were already in the process of either developing or implementing those roadmaps. And then we had interviews with key informants in Colombia, Vietnam, and Mexico, to gain some perspectives about how some of these emerging economies were addressing both the challenges and the opportunities associated with the adoption of distributed energy resources. So before I get any, much further, let me clarify a little bit how we define DERs. Clearly, this is a very rapidly and evolving concept, and there is no universally accepted definition of distributed energy resources. But we found that in most jurisdictions, these tend to include at least 6 different technologies or types of technologies. And these are distributed generation, transmission and distribution grids, stationary energy storage, electric vehicles and their charging infrastructure, demand response, and energy efficiency. And then, these technologies include both front of the meter or behind the meter technologies. And we refer to front of the meter technology to those large power generation, transmission, distribution, or storage systems at the utility scale, while behind the meter systems are those that place power generation, storage, or smart technologies at the location of end users. And this can be industrial, commercial, institutional, or household users. Next, please. So, as Mark was mentioning, we've also seen a very rapid increase in the adoption of DERs across the globe and in the particular jurisdictions that were covered by our report. Again, there's a number of drivers. I'd like to at least highlight some of them. One is that there is still very rapidly growing increase in electricity demand, and this is happening both in developed and developing countries. And in many of these countries, or even at the subnational level, many users are finding that DERs offer alternatives that are cleaner, more reliable, and in many cases cheaper than the traditional centralized systems that have existed in the past. Technology improvements and cost reductions have also been key drivers. The performance of DER technologies have improved substantially in recent years, and their cost has decreased due to applied research and development, manufacturing innovations, economies of scale in innovation, and more efficient price discovery and procurement. And that graphic on the right side of the slide shows some of the very steep price reduction that some of these technologies achieved in just a decade. In this particular graph, it's very clear that solar photovoltaic, concentrating solar power, and wind, both offshore and onshore wind costs decline very rapidly. And we know that was also the case for other technologies such as storage. The policy and regulatory environment are yet another very important driver for the strength that we have seen. And many of the policies that encourage RE generation, were maybe developed for other reasons, but they were all very favorable for the development of DER. And so policy tools that may range from renewable policies, renewable portfolio standards to tradable clean energy certificates, carbon cap and trade programs, and carbon prices or taxes have actually increased significantly the demand for DER. And also, it's very clear as we spoke with individuals both within the United States and in emerging economies, that net zero pledges or the commitments that countries and subnational governments have made that are associated with nationally determined contribution are really an indispensable driver. In, I would say, most of the countries that we looked at, they recognize that achieving the goals set by their NDCs really require the adoption of DERs to substitute energy from fossil fuels or even from biomass. So actually, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, thank you. So there's clearly a lot of benefits from the adoption of DERs, and this can be financial, economic, environmental, and social benefits. But interestingly, they can also be accrued by utilities, power makers, and end users. For example, distributed generation and demand response programs can help to meet peak power requirements and therefore enable utilities to defer or reduce costly new capital investments in centralized power generation and transmission distribution. And DER also offer the potential for better service reliability and power quality. We find that in a number of settings, one of the key advantages of DER is that they can increase energy security and improve the balance of trade for countries that rely on imported fuels for power generation. This is very important in some countries such as island nations in the Caribbean or the Pacific, but even in other countries that still rely on importing the fossil fuels to meet energy needs. And to the extent that power generation often relies on renewable energy resources, it is very important that that they contribute not only to greenhouse mitigation, but also to other environmental goals, such as reducing air or water pollution. Next, please. And so DERs clearly offer some benefits, but they can also be associated with a number of challenges. In summary, DERs are contributing to a transition from a centralized grid to a distributed electric power system. In some countries, we still have a situation where a single utility is responsible for power generation as well as transmission and distribution. But even in countries that have more competition, centralized power systems still require relatively little coordination between generation, transmission, and distribution. However, as more DERs are integrated into the grid, the complexity of the power system increases. Basically, when you have more stakeholders contributing to the system, providing different services and interacting with the grid at different geographic locations, this all adds up to create a little bit of uncertainty. For instance, distributed generation can increase the complexity of grid operations, including power control and dispatchability, voltage regulations, and system responses during disruptions. But other challenges that are also associated with increased DER adoption include the need for some utilities to change their business models, the need to develop new codes and standards to ensure the integration and interoperability of the power system, and data management and cybersecurity risks that arise as grid modernization brings increased use of digital technologies and more data to analyze, manage, and secure. Next, please. So while DERs offer a broad range of benefits, they can also be disruptive. And we find that the DER roadmap can help to harness the drivers of DER adoption and ensure that society as a whole benefits from these resources. We define a DER roadmap as a planning study, guidance document, or an action plan that can help governments, planners, and regulators, utilities, grid operators, or market operators to make better decisions on distributed energy investment and use. In many cases, they are used as a synonym for a plan, but we find that roadmaps are generally less prescriptive on timelines for achieving their targets. And based on the research that we conducted, CEDAR recommended a three-phase approach for a DER plan or roadmap process. The first phase focuses on preliminary work to secure buy-in and sponsorship, stakeholder mobilization, scoping, data collection and analysis, and communications. The second phase is formulation of the roadmap or plan. And then the third phase consists of follow-up activities, including the preparation of a budget and a schedule for implementation and an update and a plan for updating the DR roadmaps. All of the stakeholders that we interviewed mentioned that during the preparation of a DR roadmap, it is key to engage a diversity of stakeholders for input, or at least to keep them informed about the planning process and the available data and analysis. And for many of them, it was important to include key stakeholders from a broad range of sectors, including national and subnational regulators, government agencies, not only from the energy sector, but also from other sectors such as economic growth and climate change or environmental ministries, the executive and legislative branch offices, utilities and power generations, industrial, commercial, and residential users, and very importantly, community-based organizations, environmental organizations, and consumer advocacy groups that have different perspectives and can help to develop more balanced and roadmaps that can help to a better distribution of their benefits. Next slide, please. Oh, so next, please. I think. Oh. Sorry, got the previous one. Sorry, the previous slide. Thanks. Yeah. So, no. Next. Yeah, thank you. So, to the extent that roadmaps are able to engage all this broad range of stakeholders that I mentioned, they can also deliver some benefits in the very short term. One of them is that they can help all these different stakeholders to make improved decisions on DER investments and use. And they can help to develop consensus on the objectives, the targets, the technologies, and the location-specific programs and plans for procurement, financing, and implementation and investment programs. And very importantly, to the extent that they represent the interests of diverse stakeholders at the planning stage, they can also reduce regulatory delays and increase public and private investment and consensus for implementation. Next, please. So these are some of the key issues that DER roadmaps typically address. They include the available and emerging technologies, technology research and development priorities, gaps in human and institutional capacity that need to be addressed, the impact of current and new policies or regulations, how to assess the benefits and costs of DER investments, but also how to understand how they are being shared or distributed among different stakeholder groups, the sequencing and coordination of DER investments. In some jurisdictions, they prefer to focus on a specific technology at a point in time and then make sure that leads the way for other technologies that are emerging or maybe might be more disruptive. And then there's always the issue of how to monitor how these DRs are being integrated into the grid. Next, please. So this table summarizes some of the key drivers that we found in the adoption of DRs in emerging economies. Again, I won't be able to go into a lot of the detail that we found, but I'd like to highlight a few things. First is that while each of these countries is very different, and it is very clear that each of them had a very unique set of challenges that were making them or leading them to try to understand better how to harness the adoption of DER. But what I thought was particularly interesting is that in all of these cases, the adoption of DER was an integral part of ensuring that their energy systems could meet very rapidly growing electricity demand, and that they all recognized that the adoption of DER could help to simultaneously meet their energy needs while also enhancing resilience to climate change, contributing to reduce pollution and mitigate greenhouse gas emission, and in many cases to avoid investing in traditional energy infrastructure that would take very long to build and would be very costly. Next. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation, and I'll thank all of you, and I look forward to listening to the next panelist. And my email is in that slide in case you want to reach out to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Santiago. Excellent overview of a really detailed and probably impossible to summarize in that time frame, but you did a wonderful job. Thank you. I'd like to move immediately into our next speaker, who will talk about DERs in Southeast Asia, a case study, person who's actually driving the boat on Clean Power Asia work in the region, Dana Kenny, who's the principal associate for ABT Associates. Dana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mark. I'm pleased to be with all of you today discussing this important topic of distributed energy resources. The program I led through June of this year, USAID Clean Power Asia, included a strong focus on DER, especially DPV or distributed PV. And after a brief overview of the program, I will review the approach and the results of our work on DER activities in Southeast Asia. If you could please show the first slide. I neglected to do that. Lastly, I will mention research our team published comparing DPV programs and share some additional conclusions regarding promoting DERs in the region. Next slide, please. So Clean Power Asia, which was funded by the USAID Regional Development Mission in Asia, focused on deploying grid-connected renewable energy, including DERs, mainly in the lower Mekong countries, but also at the level of all of Southeast Asia. And tasks included promoting high renewable energy scenarios and planning, improving the enabling environment, and mobilizing investment. And in 2016, when the program began, Thailand was leading in renewable energy, with Vietnam following. and Cambodia and Laos at the beginning stages. Next slide, please. High renewable energy scenario planning included improving data and tools, as well as capacity building at country levels and regionally. And the enabling environment support included policy analyses and sharing best practices and lessons learned. We worked with developers, investors, and lenders also to improve the bankability of projects and facilitate financing, mainly for solar and wind projects, which included DPV. Next slide, please. At the end of the 5 years, the dollars mobilized and megawatts financially closed exceeded the target tenfold, and the policies with associated CO2 emission reduction projections were also greater than expected. The unprecedented success of Vietnam's DPV policy revision was a main contributor to this. Next slide, please. Over the past 5 years, with our partners, we worked with policymakers across Southeast Asia to address the implications and impacts of different DPV approaches. We also supported our counterparts in understanding the possibilities and the role of battery energy storage and preparing for regulations. Next slide, please. In Thailand, the first solar pilot of 100 megawatts in 2016 yielded only 3.9 megawatts of subscribers. Now, I didn't put this here, but Thailand had a long history of promoting various technologies, including DPV, even prior to the start of our program. The largest concern at that time was the impact of DPV on utility revenue and rates. So USC Clean Power Asia staff, together with Chulalongkorn University's Energy Research Institute and the U.S. National Renewable Energy Lab and Lawrence Berkeley Lab, analyzed customer economics and utility economics and technical impacts between our different programs, demonstrating that 3,000 megawatts by 2020 would have had no impact on utility rates. Though the eligibility of the program was finally extended beyond residential to schools and hospitals as recent as January of this year, those recipients are paid much less for their power and have strict capacity limits, so thus uptake has still been low. Next slide, please. The Philippines net metering program began in 2013 with excess power sold at blended generation cost. The uptake as of 2018 was approximately 13 megawatts. And it wasn't greater due to various barriers, economic and non-economic. As we engaged with the Philippines with USAID, the Clean Power Asia program, along with NREL and LBNL again, and Chulalongkorn, conducted an analysis in 2019 from all three perspectives as well, resulting in the Philippines Department of Energy incorporating these recommendations into the draft policy, and the regulator also amended their net metering rules. Following that, we provided capacity building for utilities in various forms with our partners NREL and LBNL, as well as who you'll be hearing from again, the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, and excuse me, the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, including inputs for a net metering guidebook and 6 virtual webinar trainings or webinars on distribution impact analysis and hosting capacity analysis. Those are 2 procedures or analyses that are really helpful in determining how much DPV can be added to the system without analyzing each one individually. And subsequently, the Philippines DPV increased to 31 megawatts with almost 40 million invested, more than doubling the DPV installed capacity since the level that it was at 2018, and it continues to grow. Next slide, please. In the Vietnam program began in 2017. The solar policy applied to both utility scale and distributed, but it did lead to 190 megawatts of DPV by June 2019. And with the government's desire to expand DPV uptake further, the USAID's Vietnam Low Emission Energy Program together with USA Clean Power Asia staff and NREL, conducted an international review and customer economic analysis, as well as some surveys of customers, particularly commercial industrial. And at that time, utility issues weren't a concern or a barrier, so that wasn't included. RIA revised their FIT in April 2020, as well as allowing direct power purchase agreements between private entities, taking into account the recommendations of this joint work. And the rush to meet the December 2020 deadline of this policy, meaning it would no longer be applicable or available, led to a huge surge of over 8,700 megawatts of DPV installed. Definitely a success story. Next slide, please. Grid scale project-sided storage in Vietnam was also a consideration. Curtailment risks, and grid integration limitations do remain to be as challenges for utility scale solar in Vietnam, despite an attractive FIT program, or maybe because of it. And AREA was interested in incentives for energy storage systems to address these issues. And again, VLEAP and Clean Power Asia, together with Chulalongkorn, evaluated battery energy storage's role in addressing the above issues in 2 provinces, which had a significant pipeline of solar projects. And NREL then provided an economic analysis. And though AREA decided not to provide an incentive to developers for BESS based on this analysis, a TDA study that followed, that's the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, it focuses on storage options on the grid. It may have been completed, and I know that HNEI has been involved in that study. Next slide, please. As was mentioned by Santiago, regulations become important when you're going to increase DERs. And in Laos, we focused with HNEI as our partner and the main developer of technical connection requirements for DPV. And in Thailand, it was focused on battery energy storage, also involving HNEI. So in Laos, we developed HNEI developed the technical requirements based on the latest international standards for DPV, and it was submitted in December last year, then provided or proposed by EDL. And it will reduce the need to conduct individual interconnection studies and save time and money when Laos market matures and they actually have a policy for DPV. In Thailand, the regulator really desires to develop best standards and grid codes, but they don't have the responsibility for all of the issues that need to be addressed. So it involved many stakeholders. And HNEI referenced the Laos DPV standards above, plus other international standards, to develop a guidebook. And there were stakeholder focus groups conducted and a final workshop involving the private sector. And now others, OERC and the others responsible, have the information needed to develop minimum technology standards, level the playing field, and promote quality and safety of installed technologies with less effort than they would have had to otherwise to find all of this information. Quality product indeed. Continue, please, with the next slide. So the last activity was, it really can't be called a roadmap necessarily, but it has parts of a roadmap. So Thailand has been a leader in distributed renewable energy resources, and regulatory changes are needed really to enable new business models. So as input to a project managed by Chulalongkorn University for the regulator in Thailand, USA Clean Power Asia conducted a review of key regulatory designs supporting the growth of DERs in the US, and then surveys followed by interviews were done to understand the barriers and challenges. This was focused on 3 DER types mentioned by Santiago: DPV, battery energy storage, and electric vehicles. And we also took a look at peer-to-peer electricity trading. The report provided recommendations to encourage adoption of appropriate policies and regulatory actions to enable new business opportunities, to promote fairness, maintain grid safety and reliability, and enhance transitioning utilities business models. Next slide, please. So lastly, I'd just like to share that Clean Power Asia did publish a research report that analyzed DPV compensation mechanisms and other barriers to DPV in the 3 countries assisted, which was Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. If you have trouble finding the link based on the information I've shared there, please let me know. It was only available for free for a short period of time, as I understand it. Other conclusions I'd just quickly like to cover before I conclude as my concluding remarks from our DER activities are that an integrated approach that addresses technical, economic, institutional, and political concerns and incorporates not only DPV but related DERs is the most effective approach. In our view, that's certainly true just of DPV, but more broadly, including other technologies, is critical because many of them support each other. And a key lesson is that capacity building and information distribution to equip practitioners better positions them to actually implement the policies. So I'd like to thank you and look forward to the Q&A, and my contact information is there as well. Thank you.
Anna, thank you so much. Such a really broad and diverse group of efforts for broader DER adoption, and of course capacity building that you've been directly involved in, and appreciate all the references to our work as well in that. And I'm sure there's going to be a whole host of questions. I also deeply appreciate your policy comments about balancing all of the technical and societal, environmental, and cultural concerns, very similar to policy directives we adopted in Hawaii. Without further ado, I would like to move directly on to the next speaker. I'm a little biased, but I would say that Mark Matsura is one of the top experts in the world on grid integration of high penetration renewables. And you'll hear about some of the greater details of this regarding DERs. And without any further delay, I hand the floor over to you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Mark. Hey, nothing wrong with that kind of bias for me. So yeah, I'm gonna cover kind of the Hawaii's journey, I guess, through what Mark described very accurately was kind of a tidal wave of adoption of rooftop solar. Kind of 2018 to 2013, the megawatt capacity of distributed solar in Hawaii kind of doubled each year. So it's a very fast growth because the payback periods with all the things Mark mentioned, with the tax credits and all of that, was on the order of like 3 years. So it was very, very attractive. So at that time, I was at the utility, and I was, part of the planning process, and how do we deal with all that? So this kind of the story that we're gonna kind of go through here. Oh, looks like a little bit of the formatting went off, but we'll deal with that. So as we move forward, more and more kept getting connected, and more we had to connect. So the question was, how much can we keep connecting to these distribution feeders? And what we've learned is that you can connect a lot. But the key is that you need to have the right grid codes, connection requirements. You have to have inverters that can be friendly with the grid, and you have to set up your grid for reverse power flow, because as the growth continues, that's going to happen. So you can go next slide. So just for an example, the island of Maui, all of our islands are not interconnected, so all the energy needs to be generated and used on island. It can't go anywhere. So as you can see, the island of Maui's peak system is about 200 megawatts peak demand. On that system, we have the 72 megawatts of wind. So we have 3 fairly large wind farms relative to the size of the island, and then 124 megawatts of distributed PV. So it's almost approaching the capacity of the capacity is approaching the peak demand for that island. So very, very high penetration. So all the red lines you see here are circuits, distribution circuits that the Hawaiian Electric has kind of deemed that they've kind of maxed out on their penetration levels. So a lot of them are filling up, and a lot of them are backfeeding. So we have circuits that have three times the amount of connected solar than they have load during the daytime on those circuits. So there's significant backfeed on some of them. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of focus on, well, how do you deal with all of that? And then this kind of like, it's a little bit of talking about how we got there, but kind of where we're at right now and what are the things that we have in place that help us to deal with this influx of interconnection requests and interconnection. So you can see the kind of 2013 timeframe, we were around 4,000 applications for interconnection per month, and that's on a system with about 300,000 customers. So it's over 1% of your customers per month are asking to connect distributed resources to your grid. So that's a lot. So I know there's some jurisdictions and even Hawaiian Electric where we were doing interconnection studies and things because we weren't really comfortable with how these systems are going to impact our grid. But those interconnection studies, or the IRSs, we call it interconnection requirement studies, they take a long time. So if you have 150 calendar days and to do 4,000 applications per month, that doesn't work, right? So got to figure out how do we not do that? And then in that red bubble, it's supposed to say I'd like to avoid that 150. So go to the next slide. So we kind of started out what's the level of connections that we can allow without really worrying about it too much, right? Not doing really in-depth interconnection studies or interconnection requirement studies. And if we started with the 15% peak load, which is kind of rule of thumb for any kind of generation, you can kind of connect that much and you're okay. But that didn't last very long. We got to that level really quickly. So between like 2008, 9, 10, up to 2013, we were doing studies on different kinds of circuits and trying to figure out, okay, what are the actual inverter-based level of interconnection that we can allow. So we went, and as the connections grew, we pushed that limit up and up and up. So 50, 75, 100, 120% as we tried to get more comfortable with it. We actually ran into a kind of a hard limit of 120%. And then we had to kind of lean on inverter manufacturers to say, hey, you need to address over voltage issue caused by the inverter. And once they did that, and we put that in our interconnection requirements, then we went up to 250. And then after that, we did a circuit by circuit hosting capacity analysis. So this is kind of, I think, what people will have to kind of go through and kind of get comfortable with. For Asian circuits where you have the primary voltage level and the secondary voltage level that have very long circuits, they both have long circuits, it's almost double kind of the work. So the work is cut out for you, but it takes time, but there's no shortcut to kind of figuring this stuff out. Okay, next slide. So once the standards, the requirements are in place, right? So we adopted 1547. We actually pushed the limits a bit on 1547. The test procedures are there, certification of the kind of grid-friendly inverter requirements that you have. So the 1547 2018 is where they have a lot of the stuff that Hawaiian Electric or in Hawaii and California were already requiring prior to the issuance of that. But now it's all incorporated into these standards. So once you have kind of all these things lined up and you have it in your requirements, then you can move on. In the next slide. So once you have those requirements, then we have the inverter manufacturers pre-qualify their inverters so that when somebody puts in an application, the engineer at the utility just needs to look, is that inverter on our list? Yes, it is. It's compliant. Okay, go ahead. Right? There's not a lot of work once you pre-qualify kind of the requirements for the inverter. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then to facilitate the screening process and the assessments, the utility needs information, right, to do that. And there's a lot of back and forth. A lot of times they put in the application, oh, you're missing this, and send it back. Oh, you're also missing this. So Hawaiian Electric put together an online application process that steps through the applicant of all the things he needs for the utility to do its job to allow the interconnection. So it eliminated a lot of that time and the back and forth. Okay, next slide. And on the technical review process, they put together a detailed description of this set of screens that you need to do. And some of the programs, like if you have a battery system with your PV system, you can bypass a lot of these technical screens because you won't be exporting power. It'll kind of be all for self-use. So they've tried to streamline this down to a couple of weeks. And if you're able to avoid the interconnection requirement study, and if you pass all the screens, right? And the majority of them already do, especially when you do the hosting capacity studies. But to work through these processes, okay, you can go to the next slide. It doesn't happen by itself, right? You need people. So for an organization with 300,000 customers, so a fairly small utility, right? They have 8 positions for intake of applications and processing applications and interacting with the customers. They have 4 to 5 full-time equivalent effort in doing the screening and doing the interconnection impact analysis. So in that time that I talked about, kind of the 2008 to 2013, they had to really staff up. Their staffing doubled in that time to get that kind of stuff done. The foundational work to do the hosting capacity analysis on every distribution circuit and figure out what the connection limit was for each circuit, that took 2 to 3 people about 2 years to kind of work through all those circuits. So, but with all of these, there initially with this kind of high 4,000 and up, I think prior to 2013 it was even higher. There was quite a bit of backlog, but with streamlining the process, they were able to cut that down. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then now they have, once they've done those hosting capacity analysis for each circuit, they've put that out on a web page. So a customer can type in his address and he can actually see, am I on a circuit that has room or not, right? So if my address is in a red zone, right, it doesn't say you can't interconnect more resources there, but it's going to be a little harder, right? So you might need to go through like a supplementary analysis or even maybe an interconnection requirement study. But if I live, say, in a purple or lighter color, then chances are if I want to connect a small rooftop PV system, that is not going to be a problem. So in that way, the customer kind of knows going in, even before putting in his application, what level of effort is it going to be to get an interconnection at that location. Okay, next slide. And I think that's it. So yeah, so it's in summary, rooftop solar, if the programs are there, people are going to want it. So you need to be ready to kind of be ready for that wave to come. So adopt the right grid codes. Luckily, you don't have to rebuild the wheel there. IEEE 1547 and the UL certifications kind of go a long way in covering that. But you still kind of have to put in your system specific settings for the different performance capabilities of the inverter. You have your inverter compliant list that cuts down a lot of time. And then work through the kind of the how high you can go without really looking too closely at it. Get comfortable with that. That's going to take some work, and just evolve over time. It's also important once people put in their systems that you have a post installation inspection to make sure that the settings that you want in inverters are actually set, or else you're going to be kind of stuck with a bunch of legacy systems that are not set correctly. So we have that process in place here. Yeah, and be ready to staff it up and so that you can avoid having the big backlog like we had, and doing that work. Okay, I think that was my last slide.
Thank you, Mark, for that crash course on DER integration. Yeah, so a lot. Just like your first slide said, a lot. But thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. And to make sure that our last two speakers have enough time, and then we have enough time for some questions. When we're talking about places that don't have flat demand, that are growing rapidly, nothing, we already mentioned Vietnam and other places in Asia, but India has been growing rapidly. And when you do that, you really look at demand side management and energy efficiency. And the person that's leading a team that's working on that in India is Abhishek Ranjan, and he has an exciting story to tell us. So without any further ado, Abhishek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Am I audible?
Yep. You're on.
Sure. I think the slides are gone. Should I display? They're here. Right. So thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening as per your time zones, all of you. And thanks USAID and ICLAI to give me the opportunity. In the next 10 minutes, I'll be taking you through a picture and both verbal journey of what we have done in the area of distributed energy resources. So this is the first picture I would like to share with you. This is the 100 kilowatt solar PV and a carport along with an EV charger you can see over here, which is there on one of our grid substations. This is an indication of what we are doing in the area of distributed PV and distributed EV. So we are merging PV and EV charging so as to have a complete synergetic benefits of it. Next slide. So this is the summary of what I'm going to say today. One is the distributed energy resources is playing a very significant role in the energy transition because it has a direct bearing on the load curve, load shaping, which I'll show in some subsequent slides. Now, it is more effective to have energy transition at the source of the demand. The contribution to the energy transition may vary from state to state or country to country, depending upon the share of the distributed energy resources in the total resource required. So that depends upon the integrated resource planning of the country or the state or the nation. Now, what I'm trying to submit to all of you is the combined usage of the DER, that is rooftop solar, managed EV charging, energy storage, which could be a community storage behind the meter or front of the meter, and demand response. All these four we are targeting now, and they together offer us a very good platform to effect energy transition. And very thankful to USAID and NREL that we have done a couple of studies in both the DISCOMs here and PSCS very recently. I think others will throw some light on that study. The concept of DER as a dispatchable resource is gaining currency. So very recently, the National Electricity Policy to 2021 has been floated by Government of India, where they have recognized that the DER is a resource, and now there's a requirement for effecting change in the grid code. We have pursued very aggressive initiative to promote DER and DER integration. We have studies have been done, which I'll talk about later. And this, I would like to say that the DER enabled energy transition as well as DISCOM's transition to a distributed system operator as well. Next slide. So this is last year, Delhi. If you see, COVID lockdown happened on March 24th. And after that, the Delhi turns blue. Blue means no pollution or less pollution. We have an evidence, and the right hand side, it shows the deep red color means more aerosol optical depth, AOD. Whereas on the right hand side in 2020, it reduced a lot. So energy transition starts at the load center. So when the activities are limited or activities are backed up with sustainable energy resources, definitely energy transition happens, and it can happen very, very quickly. Next, please. So this is about us. The green color, if you see the Delhi map over here, is where we serve, and magenta color is our sister concern. Together, we serve about 70% of Delhi as a whole. We believe firmly in the RE transition, and that will be evident in the next slide, if I can request. So this is about the energy transition, ET, the big picture. On the top donut chart talks about the energy breakup in the year 1920. 64% of what was met by coal, 3% was RE, and 13% was hydro. Now, this is changing this year. 3% becomes 18%, and coal goes down to 53 because we are adding more and more resources in the RE supply side also. Hydro becomes 12%, almost constant. The breakup, if you see here, 40% is about wind and 54 is solar, 6% is waste to energy. If you talk about the capacity breakup, if you see the capacity wise, the 1199 megawatt, that is pure play supply side, utility scale RE. And apart from this, we expect to be about 100 megawatt rooftop solar as well. 29% capacity terms. We are going to be in terms of RE by close of this year. 64% solar and 34% wind. So clearly we see a decline in coal up to 40% by capacity, and we are exiting more of them. Next slide. This has been our journey so far in BRPL and in BYPL. Today, if you see, together with BACS, we are at 100 megawatt peak. For Delhi as a whole, the potential is about 2000 megawatt. And in BACS area, we have exceeded 100 megawatt. We expect in the next 7 to 8 years, we'll be crossing about 500 megawatt in our area. Now, to give you a perspective, India as a whole, we just recently announced 100 gigawatt renewable energy contribution, and that is almost slightly more than 25% of our capacity. Our target in India as a whole is about 450 gigawatt by 2030. And then it also involves a lot of distributed PV resources. Next slide. Now, this curve on the left-hand side, if you see the summer daily load curve on a peak day in summer, and the right-hand side is the daily load curve on a winter day. If you see, the peaks are not exactly coincidental with the RE generation. So there is an opportunity to make them load following. Now, load following means the RE along with battery storage and the demand response. It can be made definitely load following. Now, distributed energy resources will play a very important role in enabling the load following characteristics of the renewable energy, because when you induce demand side management or demand response, you are trying to shift demand aligned with the RE being produced, because you are not able to shift the RE generation profile. Simultaneously, you can reduce flexibility, including the battery storage, and to match these two curves, that means generation curve and the load curve. Next slide. Now, this is at the distribution transformer level. If you see here, the load curve of a residential DT, daily variation is very, very high, right? From this 1000 kVA DT, from 900 to almost 450 kVA, this is the daily diurnal variation. And there is a huge role to be played by distributed energy resources, including solar PV plus battery storage, to make it uniform, to levelize it. And once you levelize this load curve, it also enables increase in the RE share on the grid, because RE has a must-run status in our country. So when you levelize this, you are backing down coal-based stations, and therefore the share of energy, the renewable energy in the total energy mix goes up. Next slide. Here we talk about, we have tried to overlap the daily load curve with a solar generation curve, and also when and how EVs can be charged. So the green portion on the left-hand side talks about the EV charging, where there is a low loading on the assets and the wind share is on a higher side, or you can also have a battery storage. One of the studies that we did with NREL, I think I have some slides later on, where we did that. While in the evening time, we are avoiding the EV charging. Only exceptions may be allowed. Why? Because this is going to piggyback on the system peak and also lead to more and more coal generation. So we want to push this EV charging to the different valley filling hours. Next slide. This is a snapshot from the study that we have done with NREL. And on the left corner, top corner, you see without battery energy storage, we see that the EV charging happening without battery energy storage, and during the valleys, if the EV charging is happening, it is not loading them. But during the peak hours, when it is happening along with the peak, it is raising the peak and asset loading. Now, on the right-hand side, if you see, along with the battery energy storage, off-peak period, the battery energy storage and the EV both get charged. While in the peak hours, the battery energy storage discharges to charge the. So this transition actually is happening. So in the off-peak hours, RE energy getting stored in the battery, and in the peak hours, you are discharging the battery to charge the EV. Dual benefit: peak shaving benefit, number one; number two, energy transition benefit. And therefore, on the left-hand side bottom, you see that the red curve uses utilization of the total DT is increased. The utilization, the low duration curve, the utilization pattern of the DT increases actually. So, on the right hand side, if you see the DT loading with the high EV penetration and the BESS integrated actually leads to a relaxed grid without much overloading. So this is as per the study done by Enral for us last year in 2020. Next slide. Now, walking the talk, we are leading the RTS PV, rooftop solar PV, distributed PV revolution in Delhi with the support of Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Government of India and the Government of Delhi. State government policy on the solar and the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, CFA policy, that is subsidy policy for the residential consumer, we are heavily focused on. Up to 40% rebate is available. And as we speak, we are celebrating the in Hindi, we call it Amrit Mahotsav. So, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. So, we are celebrating this as an independence festival. And we are pursuing with our consumers through webinars and seminars to go ahead. We have a dedicated cell, how to penetrate it. In fact, this solar revolution started in 2018 with help of USAID and PhD program, where we designed the program and launched the first community solar dissemination program, Solarize Dwarka. Dwarka is a place in West Delhi. Utility-led EV charging programs, again, first RFP has on empowerment of the charging point operator partners for private and semi-public EV charging has been rolled out last month. So what is going to happen is consumers is going to ask distribution utility through a single window system online to give a metered connectivity along with a EVS. And that is going to promote more and more distributed charging at home places and workplaces, which will be managed charge. Community base of 1 megawatt hour storage at distribution transformer level at 6 different locations have been in implementation. We expect it to be on bar and commissioned by September 1st week this year. That is maybe 10-15 days from now. And this is under the regulatory approval. So regulator has approved that. Behind the meter BESS clubbed with the solar PV port and store. The pilot is already on. The plans are there for wider rollout this year. This is a portable solar PV. It can be folded and taken away. This is with support of GIZ Germany. Automated demand response clubbed with energy efficient appliances program has already been rolled out. This is again a load shaping initiative towards adoption of distributed energy resource management system DERMS. Very happy to state that Bureau of Indian Standard is in process of adopting communication standard, probably OpenADR, as a de facto standard for all the DERs communication with the DERMS of a DISCOM. So that is a very, very important step towards making DER dispatchable. First, behavioral energy efficiency program is already in operation at BSES. Since the past 2 years, again with the help of USTDA, the pilot was done. And Oracle Utilities they have done. So we have seen up to 2% of savings by the energy in energy bills of the consumers as well. We have very strong partnership, and we are proud to state that institutes of international repute like National Renewable Energy Laboratory, GIZ, USAID, Fraunhofer, TERI, etc., which is facilitating this transition through study. In fact, the RE transition study or integration of rooftop solar study was first done by GIZ for us in year 2017, where we say how much solar PV can be integrated at the distribution transformer level without impacting the production or overvoltage issue or the system instability issues. One number that emerged out of the study was that up to 75% of the rated capacity of the DT, you can safely, without any upgrade, thermal upgrade of the grid, you can do so. And this 75% goes beyond 150% if at all you are installing solar PV along with a battery where the export to the grid is minimal or nil. So that we did in 2017, and we are following that in Delhi for the last 4 years. Next slide. I think this is the last slide, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. You definitely packed a lot in there, and of course, wonderful stories about how you manage load and introduce energy efficiency. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of follow-up questions. So thank you. Our last speaker is truly appropriate. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as everyone knows, has been driving innovation in the United States along with the other labs, but particularly NREL. And Dr. Nagarajan has been, one of the leading researchers that, particularly in the western part of the United States, has been working directly with utilities to be able to apply these solutions and to be able to move forward, high rates of renewable penetration. Again, one of the great experts, and very fortunate to have him round out this group of panelists. With that, Adarsh, could you please have the floor? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I guess you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. A lot has been already said by Abhishek, by Mark, Matsura, and everybody else. I'll try not to repeat much, but I'll try to use my time as well. So this slide deck, I'll be covering some of the efforts that I got a chance to be a part of, supported by USAID, and Abhishek was a part of this effort too. I got a chance to work with 2 institutions in Delhi, serving different parts of Delhi. One is BRPL, other is BYPL. So some of the results will be there. So next slide. To be more specific, as a part of our interactions with USAID and Greening the Grid team in India, we NREL had a chance to develop 3 projects. These are the 3 reports, all 3 are public. We started with developing solutions for solar and storage and everything. Then we went on looking at how can we evolve the grid. And then we finally went into demand side management as well. Each of this project developed a solution, a reusable framework, which we hope can be used by anybody. Next slide. I'm going to skip this slide. Seeing the context, all the new technologies are affecting the operation of distribution utilities in general, and that's where we got all the motivations from. Consequences. This is very important. So the shape of the load curve is changing as we speak. The utility operations and assets were set up and built for a certain shape of consumption or a certain pattern of consumption. As there is more solar and more electric vehicles and more storage, the shape gets totally muddled, maybe to your advantage or not sometimes. It's a risk, it's a gamble sometimes. So quite a lot of research can be done to provide support on this sort of research questions. Next slide. I'm going to quickly run through all the 3 studies we did. The very first effort, need 1, is what I call them. The very first need was to evaluate impact of emerging technologies on system voltages. We can add whatever we want to add, except if the grid voltages go bad, that's a problem. So we developed a reusable framework that had the ability to model the distribution feeder from its nuts and bolts all the way to putting all sorts of assets on top of that model, such as batteries, electric vehicles. And we leveraged NREL's supercomputer, and we ran many simulations. This framework can be used or run on any computer. but for NREL, we use a supercomputer because we're doing mass simulations. Then we developed a series of technical and economic analysis, which we neatly call as techno-economic analysis. We looked at how one leads to other, one costs to the other, and vice versa. Next slide. The other tool that we developed with utility in Delhi, BYPL, is Evolve. There's an E missing in the end for some reason. This is a framework that we developed. We realized that there's a lot of data lying around when it comes to load and consumption. Some are billing, some are SCADA information, some are many. Then we also started talking about forecasting in general. What is forecasting? Can I forecast? Can I still use the word forecasting if I want to capture how the load will be 10 years from now, 5 years from now? So then we figured that there's a need for a dashboard where any utility should be able to just drag and drop their transformer loads, substation loads, customer consumption patterns, their monthly energy consumption type stuff. And on top of that, they should be able to put the future growth projections of assets such as electric vehicles, storage, solar at any scale, and should be able to visualize how things will be. Next slide. So that's what Evolve is. It's a dashboard. It takes all sorts of inputs, takes all the way from solar to electric vehicles to storage. It also can dispatch storage, size storage for you. It can look at electric vehicle count to the load shape calculation. That can be a quite complicated topic. Whereas the dashboard does all of it. It's a very handy dashboard anybody can use. It's accessible to you all on GitHub, open source. Next slide. The need 3, or the third effort that we did, is a bit of what Abhishek referred to. The way distribution utilities were asked to operate, if you go a decade or a while ago, is consumption was looked at as not to be touched, not to be thought of. You give whatever the customer wants. But the idea of demand side management or educating customers to be a little more responsible, not used during peak hours, is growing in space and time. So if we choose to unlock demand side management, how to do it, what's the benefit? For example, in this particular scenario, the load duration curve and the time series curve for an example utility, you can see that the peak load happens for less than 10 hours in a year, whereas the investment in a utility happens to just make that happen. It's marginal usage of assets, but heavy investment goes into that. So enabling demand side management, even getting a 3% reduction, 4% reduction will save many dollars, or much of money. Next slide. So for example, in BRPL, these are some of the results we got. For certain rate structures, we can get up to 2% in summer reduction, 4% in winter reduction, based on so many modeling and things we did. We also developed a tool for this as well. And the question that we tried to assess in this effort was, this project was, developing rate structures is a question. Anybody can, like, it's a common understanding to do time of use, but the question that makes the decision challenging is, what should be the peak to off-peak ratio for price structures, and what ratio of peak to off-peak is effective to achieve the goal that you want to achieve as a utility. And we developed a tool called EFFORT, which stands for effectiveness of rate structures. We are so close to making it public at this point, which will be maybe anytime soon. Reach out to me maybe if you're interested in assessing your rate structures and its effectiveness. This should be all from my side. Next slide. Yeah, overall, we had some great opportunity to contribute into the Indian power sector. Utilities in India are so progressive, particularly Abhishek's BRPL, BYPL, Green the Grid support. We had a chance to get deep into the challenges, motivations, cost effectiveness, technical benefits to the best extent we can. We developed multiple reusable solutions for this purpose. And these solutions should be usable all along any part of the world. That's a premise behind it. The very first, just to re-summarize, the very first report, which is named 1 here, looked at voltage impacts of assets and their costs, economics, and technical details. The second work with USA Green the Grid looked at demand side management, which is demand response, rate structures, time of use. The third effort looked at figuring out a very basic need, which is visualization and assessing the patterns for the future so that utilities can just plot their results, their load consumptions, and on top of that, take the projections that they are having from studies and put them on top of it and look at how their loads will change. What sort of investments should they do to cater to such load patterns? Their peaks may shift entirely. Their off peaks may shift entirely. Their valleys that they knew for the last 20 years may change entirely. So yeah, we had a chance to contribute to different challenges, and hopefully all these reports may provide more knowledge. Feel free to reach out to NREL. Happy to support. That's all I have from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Adarsh. We'll move quickly. I think we only have really 5 minutes probably for questions. So we have so many questions in the chat. And some of them are extremely broad. So I found a comment by Dana very fascinating about making projects more bankable. A lot of this is going to require money, and particularly in areas, some of the questions, multiple questions talked about the affordability of systems, particularly in areas where the population isn't wealthy. So what will become, particularly when you're financing things like battery energy storage systems, which was mentioned, how will programs like Clean Power Asia de-risk DER development and contribute to a more orderly investment climate? Could some of you address that? Maybe Dana could start.
Well, our program is ended, so that question will apply to a new programs that I will be involved in, or that USAID Regional Mission in Asia will implement. And certainly their vision is that DERs are a big part of the future. How will we de-risk? Well, that's a good question, because frankly, for utility scale, we never actually succeeded too far in finding de-risking solutions. Most of the countries want sovereign guarantees, and you're de-risking because the investors need de-risking. So if it depends if it's behind the meter or in front of the meter. If it's behind the meter, you're really not going to be worrying about de-risking projects for the customers. It's mostly if you can have funding be project-based. It's just you can come up with innovative ways of financing it, but it's just not going to be the same. So I'm just going to leave it at that and see if anybody else has anything to offer, because frankly, I haven't really thought about de-risking in the context of DERs on the system. I guess if they're project owned, it's similar to other, developer owned projects, but if it's customer owned, it's a whole different kettle of fish, as we like to say in America. So I'm going to see if anybody has.
I can jump in a little bit. So for Hawaii, the fairness issue became a big issue when the market was really hot because, yeah, people with roofs, people that own homes are usually people with a little bit more money. So they were benefiting the most from DER. They've restructured from full retail NEM to more of a wholesale payment for the export. But even then now, as kind of the market's beginning to saturate a bit, so the people that don't own roofs, people that rent apartments, things like that, they're developing community-based solar projects. So an investor will come in, and then people that you know can opt in and invest through their bill. So kind of on the bill impact. So they're trying to provide opportunities for you know lower income people that can't afford PV systems to participate in the solar market.
Oh, that's a really good point. Thanks for raising that. Nikhil, is it time? You know, I think we've just about run out of time. Do you want to conclude here, or do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we can take one more question.
Another question that came up was about non-conventional sources of energy are the first priority. So I assume that that's talking about DERs instead of utility scale, but they're not easily accessible. What can an individual do to save energy and conserve it? I guess it gets back to you know, trying to provide local empowerment at the customer level.
Yeah, I guess it's going to the best type of, you know, energy is the energy not used. So rather than trying to offset it with renewables, but yeah, so I think in Hawaii we kind of take a two-pronged approach. So we have renewable RPSs, and we also have energy efficiency goals that are similar and also very aggressive. So I think it's up to regulators and policymakers, I guess, where they want to place incentives, right, for getting to the goals that they want to get to.
Well, with that, we'll have to. One thing that will occur is that we'll gather all these questions and we'll allow the panelists to be able to respond to them in writing if they choose. So you'll be able to come back and I believe the organizers will have these posted for anybody that has written questions, or if you have additional questions. And with that, I think I'm going to, first of all, I want to thank our esteemed panelists who really are outstanding in their field and gave us far too much to think about, really. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Nikhil.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for expertly navigating us through the presentations in that session. Also, really grateful for all the speakers, starting with the roadmap and presenting all the work done across different contexts and countries. We know we have just crossed 90 minutes, but I'll try to finish this quickly. So just to conclude things, giving an overview of the Asia-Leds partnership, the Great Renewable Energy Community of Practice, under which this session is being conducted. Next slide, please. So the ALP is one of the platforms focused on the Asian region. This is a platform with a LEDS global partnership, which looks to support countries and governments and practitioners on implementing actions that support climate goals, such as the NDC. It's supported by by GIZ within the support of the Paris Agreement Support Project. Next slide. Yeah, so the partnership, the secretariat is hosted by ICLEI South Asia along with other ICLEI offices in the region. We work on various thematic areas supported by working groups and experts specific to those areas. Next slide. Essentially, the partnership targets countries in the Asia Pacific region. We have a number of members, over 1,200 members now, representing nearly 14-15 countries in the region. Next slide. So to serve our members, We have communities of practice across 5 thematic areas. These are essentially interactive networks for peer learning, for knowledge sharing across these focus areas. So the one we have today in this session under is the grid scale renewable energy community of practice. We also have similarly communities under the building energy efficiency, for clean mobility, for integration between different levels of governance, for climate action, and also for finance. Next slide. Under the GRE Corp, we have around 60 plus members, and some of you, including NREL, including Dana, and also HNEI, we have been part of previous events and knowledge sharing initiatives through this. We provide opportunities for learning through webinars, through workshops, and so on. Also, detailed technical support is also provided as needed. Remote technical support is provided as needed. So recently, next slide, we have provided support to countries such as Mongolia and Nepal, specifically to the electricity regulatory commissions of these countries. Members do benefit if they have specific technical needs, and also if they are willing to engage in peer learning opportunities and share experiences, from their regions and their initiatives. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we have recently, with the support of NREL, we've been providing support to Nepal and Mongolia, and we encourage everyone to join the GRE Corp. We have the link here to be part of this larger community of practitioners who are really engaged, on a day-to-day basis on the transition to clean energy, including the focus area today on uptake of distributed energy resources. So that's it from our side. Also, we'll be sharing all the presentations and the materials post the webinar. Like mentioned, any pending questions, we will make sure that we get back to you, and these are addressed by the speakers. Yeah, that's it from our side. Just before we close, we would request all panelists, if possible, if you can switch on your videos so we can just have a group photo. Yeah, my colleague Sasi would let us know once we are done. Yes, Sasi, are we done? Hello.
I got the photos.
Yeah. Thank you again to all the panelists, and also to the attendees for sending your questions, and also taking out time to attend this engaging discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Bye-bye.